Hi, everyone. Welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. I am delighted on this episode to be talking a second time with author Chris Tebbetts. Chris is a person who's worked with folks like James Patterson, Jeff Probst, and I'll also mention the book Me, Myself, and Him, and Shadow Island was the Jeff Probst book as well. Um,
Stranded is the name of the series.
Yes, the Stranded series. So thank you for jumping in again, and I believe we're talking about craft on this episode.
I believe we are. I love talking about this stuff.
Yeah. We'll of course mention any titles that you'd like to mention as we go, but by means of a first question, uh, thinking about writing, I know that it's a challenging process, so curious about the challenges that you faced in the craft.
Just in the craft of writing, the sort of day-to-day kind of thing.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I'm so in process about what my challenges are. They're sort of evolving. And I think that's a result of the fact that I've been doing more and more teaching, and teaching really teaches you what you know about this stuff.
Hmm.
Um, but I think like one of the biggest revelations for me about the overall challenge of the creative process, and I think this is, if not universal, pretty common, is the amount of time we as writers and storytellers spend on our craft not knowing what we're doing or not knowing what's supposed to happen next. We have to sort of exist in that space of not knowing and of opening up to whatever the story wants to be and of listening. I anthropomorphize my stories quite a bit and it's sort of listening for them to start telling me what it is they want to be. Uh, and also looking for that place. I think of it as almost like a seesaw fulcrum place where I spend the first part of the process pushing and pushing and sort of telling the story what it is and giving the story its identity and still until it starts to take that on for itself. And then it starts telling me what it wants to be. And it's a little bit more pulling at that point. Um, and a lot of that kind of anthropomorphization sounds so cliche until you learn how very true it actually can be.
Well, until you have your hands on the thing and you're trying to actually mold something, right?
Or your character says, I don't want to do that, or, stubborn with you, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And then there's also I think the most common phenomenon, and it's not universal, but it's one of the most common phenomenon among writers that I'm aware of, is imposter syndrome and this sense of sort of who cares about what I have to say, or why would anybody want to read this story, and all those sort of, devil on the right shoulder voices that happen along the way.
Mhm.
And new thinking about that, the sort of the biggest challenge about that for me has been to let go of needing to be rid of those things, but rather to learn to write with them, let them come along. But as Elizabeth Gilbert says, they have to sit in the back seat.
Yeah. Yeah. In terms of the day-to-day process, do you have a particular set of steps that you go through? Does the process change depending on the project?
I have some relative consistency around needing to start first thing. And if I choose to do something else first thing in the morning, I at least now am familiar enough with my own process to know I'm less likely to get real quality, at least drafting done on a given day. Mornings are really important to me. And
Mhm.
one thing that I've sort of stumbled into in the last year are shared writing times online. I have a group that I Zoom with from 7 to 8, 7 days a week, every single morning. And it's been phenomenal for everyone's productivity. And we just get online, we chat for 5 minutes, we write for 50 minutes, we chat for 5 minutes and say goodbye every day. Um, and between the accountability and also the regularity, the momentum that comes from regular writing, it's been really great. In terms of a specific story, I am an outliner. I usually start with the old note cards on the bulletin board, usually color coded for one thing or another, as a means of getting a handle on not necessarily my whole story, but what I know so far about my story at the beginning of the process.
Mhm.
Draft slowly, I re-outline, sort of take stock of what I have. And then my new approach to revision has been the way I describe it is drive around the block more often and more quickly and move through the draft and fix what you know how to fix. I fix what I know how to fix and don't worry about what I don't know how to fix yet. Oh, that's my alarm saying I have an interview with you.
That works. And alarms help, it sounds like, setting the schedule.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Now, I know lots of people try to navigate the publication process, and there are all sorts of problems they encounter. There's lots of patience that goes into that. So any advice for people that are navigating that process and attempting to get their work out there?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the word patience. It is a slow-moving machine. And I have learned to patience is actually an interesting topic in this area when it comes to, navigating the publication process because usually the writing process takes more time than we want it to almost always, or maybe just plain always.
Hmm.
The submission and waiting to hear process takes more time than we want it to. So on the one hand, I have learned to be a little more patient. Like if I'm feeling nudgy about something, or I want to, try and reach out to the editor and possibly make a pest of myself or possibly advocate for myself. I try to like not do it the moment I get that impulse. I try to give it at least a couple more days, and it's astounding the number of times I have then heard from somebody. If I just give it a little, the length of my patience plus 2 days or whatever it might be. Um,
Patience plus.
yeah. The flip side of that, though, and this is why it's a dance and why there's never any like super perfect clean answers for these kinds of questions. The flip side is nobody cares about your project and nobody's looking out for you as much as you are. And I don't mean that cynically. I just mean I think looking back, I would more frequently have wished that I had advocated for myself a little more strongly, reached out a little more quickly, and to keep my project moving along, or to just to advocate for myself in that very slow moving process that this can be, and to try and speed it up where I can. So my answers almost contradict each other, but that's because every situation is a little bit different.
Yeah.
I wrote down some notes here.
Hmm.
Uh, the thing I wrote down to myself is take it personally the right way. One of the things that I love about this kind of work is that I feel like my work is very much a part of me. Creative work is very much a part of us. So while any individual rejection from a publisher is, very, very likely not personal, except in very strange circumstances, the work is personal. And I
Hmm.
take value in that. And that means I'm setting myself up to be hurt by rejection in a way that I might not in another field. But I'm okay with that if I remember how much I love what I do and how much I love the stories and the characters. I think that the pain of rejection is a mark of my love of the work.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense, and that's probably the clearest explanation I've heard of that because it is personal and it is a piece of our lives and our history, and it's so hard when someone says, "Well, this just isn't. You're just not quite there. This isn't the right fit," or they give you the nice form letter, which I have a pretty sizable collection of, as most writers do, I think.
Yeah. The other thing I talk about with people is if somebody, I get a lot of calls from people saying, I'm trying to break into publishing, could we just chat about it? And the people who don't ask many questions, or if I say my spiel and they're like, okay, thanks, and they don't have no follow-up, or if they're not adding to their to-do list, getting to know the market, getting to know who's publishing what you're publishing, that sort of thing. This is more
Hmm.
for beginners than experienced folks. I try to encourage them to recognize that, maybe I even talked about this with you the last time, that there's two kinds of showing up. One is for the art of the art, and the other is for the business of the art. And getting published is its own discipline.
Yeah, yeah. Now I know Writer's Market, Writer's Digest, those used to be go-to sources, but any places where you would recommend people go if they want to get an eye on the market at this point?
Um, yeah, I don't. Are those Writer's Digest books still being put out every year? Because they used to be
I
a resource.
Yeah, I haven't actually followed them in a while because I tend to go, there's a website called Every Writer's Resource that I use,
Okay.
and some of those, in Poets and Writers magazine, but I actually don't know if the Writer's Digest is still being published.
Yeah, I'm not sure. But garden variety curiosity and garden variety initiative will get anybody a whole heap of information of the type that we're talking about right now. Get online, talk to people. If you know people who are publishing, ask them, sort of what they're up to without getting too invasive about other people's private information. But, networking, as abhorrent as that can be to a lot of introverted writers, there simply is no substitute for it. And the question for me is just how can I network? How can I be interacting with people and building relationships in a way that is more comfortable versus less comfortable for me? Sort of, customizing my own networking process to my own proclivities and shyness or whatever it might be. But but do it. Build, it's about building relationships.
Yeah, yeah. And to that point, I'm sure any thoughts on agents and sort of the value of an agent versus other approaches?
You know, two two things have been true over the last several years, which is on the one hand, in terms of traditional publishing, an agent is more and more necessary. And depending on what area of publishing people are talking about, it might be just plain necessary.
Hmm.
Measure that against one's own entrepreneurial streak and their ability to seek out publishers who will accept unagented submissions, and then measure that again in turn against the sort of the rise of the self-publishing market and the lowering of stigma around self-publishing. A lot of
Hmm.
people are doing very well with that. If that's your thing, I've never pursued it, so I can't speak to that. I, again, as somebody who likes to have a purely creative relationship with my editors, and to not have to advocate for myself around contracts and that sort of thing, an agent is great just, on emotional terms, not to
Hmm.
mention business terms, and somebody to sort of go to bat for you when you need them. So I find it essential, but I don't think it's essential for every single writer.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and to the self-publishing point, I think it's so important also to have at least a beta reader and editor because I know my writing and I can write something and think, oh, this is wonderful, and not see the mistakes or kind of go into that autocorrect. It's always nice to get a an alternative perspective on your work before sharing it out there.
I mean, for a lot of writers I know, and this is true of me, but the learning curve for those, when we're new at it, is realizing that the editor is potentially anyway your very best friend.
Hmm.
Their
Hmm.
job is to make your work better.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Well, I think I only have one more official question on the list, but we can talk about other areas of craft if you'd like. The last question is a three-parter.
Okay.
Um, of course, I always like to ask about what's new, what's next in terms of your work and the places where people can go to connect.
Sure. I have always said I like variety more than specialization, so I like doing lots of different things. Although middle grade fiction is really my biggest heart work and the place where I publish the most. I'm
Mhm.
actually right now, for the first time in about 20 years, I'm not writing anything for young readers, and I'm working with a client on a self-help book that they want to see put out into the world. That's a new experience for me. And the next thing I have coming out is an audio drama with James Patterson on audible.com. So that's sort of a grown-up murder mystery, basically radio play. These audio dramas have gained a lot of popularity recently.
Mhm.
Uh, and then waiting beyond all of that is my forever unfinished middle grade spy comedy that am really hoping to get back to this spring.
Nice, nice.
In terms of finding me, I believe I'm at Chris Tebbetts, if you can spell my name, Tebbetts, on most platforms.
Great, great. Any final words of advice on craft or encouragement to writers? Particularly, I'm thinking about a group of students that I'm working with right now in AP Language and Composition. So, any particular words to maybe the young writer out there who's kind of thinking about this world?
I'll just share a very specific idea or tip that it's sort of my new favorite thing that I've been thinking about. And I've been thinking about negative space, which for me is a broadly applicable idea, at least the way I think of it, which is to say, what's the primary trait in this character, or what's the primary emotion in this scene, or what's the primary idea behind the theme of the book, or the overall mood, and then what is the opposite of that trait? What's the negative space that actually helps it sort of, stand out in starker relief? If you're writing a very funny scene, the opposite of that might be something very sad or very serious. Can you add a drop, a sort of, I call it a homeopathic dose of the opposite of what you're already doing to sort of, it's like putting salt on fruit to make it taste a little bit better.
Hmm.
Can you add a little bit of so-called negative space to whatever you're doing, to make the character or the story or the scene or the beat a little more dimensional?
I like that. I like that. And that gets at like nuance too, which is sometimes hard to get around to.
Yes, and it also speaks to I think one of the trickiest things in craft, in writing craft overall, which is trying to figure out what you have not put in, what's
Yeah,
not there that I haven't thought about.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, lots of wisdom and lots of wonderful words. Chris, thank you for the time. Did we miss anything that you want to make sure to share before we close out?
I guess no, other than I'm doing a lot of teaching, and whether it was with me or with somebody else, I cannot recommend the Highlights Foundation enough for their
Mhm.
online classes and their on-campus courses in Honesdale, Pennsylvania. It's a fantastic place. So take one of my classes, take somebody else's classes, but check out the Highlights Foundation.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you again, and glad to have you back anytime to talk about projects, the radio play, or radio drama, audio drama. Is that right?
Any of the above, audio drama, yeah, go.
Okay, all right. As well as the middle grade spy fiction that's coming along.
All right. Thanks so much for having me.
Anytime. It's a pleasure.